What's good, cubers? It's your boy Matt, and I'm back today with another video, and I wanted to talk a little bit about cube archetypes and how to include those archetypes in our cubes, how to support them. I think I might do a few of these videos, so if there's an archetype you want to see, drop a comment below and we'll make you next on the list. Other than that, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss anything in the future. Let's get started. So the first archetype I wanted to start with is Lands Matters, because it's one of my favorite archetypes and I don't often hear it discussed in terms of cube. So Lands Matter is an archetype that Wizards invented really in the Zendikar block, using cards like Oracle of Moldiah to let you play more lands, and then cards like Avenger of Zendikar and Lotus Cobra that have landfall triggers that give you benefits for playing those lands, which is really great and really cool. And you'll notice that these are actually frequently cube cards. But we can't just play all the landfall stuff from Zendikar block. We have to vary it so that our stuff overlaps with the other aspects of our cube. In cube, Lands Matter looks a little different than it did in Zendikar block for a couple of reasons. One is that the lands are just better in cube, and so using these lands and reoccurring them for value make the decks way more potent than they ever could have been in Zendikar block. The other difference is that in Zendikar block you really spent most of your time playing lands and getting landfall triggers, which we still do a little bit in cube. But in cube, the archetype of Lands Matters really revolves around putting lands in your graveyard for value and then pulling them back out and replaying them for value, or some type of land destruction that is really one-sided even though it appears symmetrical. So let's talk about staples that we see in cube Lands Matters archetypes. Now take a good look at this list. I've tried to group similar cards together. So for example, Wildfire and Armageddon are big land wraths that destroy the entire board. Crucible of Worlds lets you play lands out of your graveyard, so if you do wrath the board, you recover much more quickly than your opponent. Avenger of Zendikar, we saw him, he's from Zendikar block. Landfall triggers are super important with him. Primeval Titan fetches more lands out of your deck. Lotus Cobra gives you landfall triggers that let you ramp. Land Tax lets you fish more lands out of your deck. Life of the Loam fishes the lands that you tossed into your graveyard, or dredges cool lands or other stuff into your graveyard, which is nice. And then Strip Mine, Flooded Strand, Wasteland are all cards that you want to play over and over again for repeated value. Any fetch land will thin your deck, and Strip Mine and Wasteland can just be game ending, especially if Crucible of Worlds is on the battlefield. Lastly, Mutavault or any man land could be a win condition in a Lands Matters decks because it dodges big board wipes like Wrath of God, then you wake up your lands and you swing in for victory that way. And what you'll notice about these cards is that you probably already play a lot of them in your cube. Crucible of Worlds is very common in cube, as is Strip Mine. Most cubes play fetches, land tags, Lotus Cobra, and Wildfire is actually a pretty common archetype in cube, so chances are you're already running a lot of these cards. So what cards do we need to include to make Lands Matters a stronger, more real archetype in cube? So here's a list of some really solid support cards for Lands Matters, and I want to start off talking about Mox Diamond. Although Mox Diamond is exorbitantly expensive at this point, you can pick up Chrome Mox or some other artifact that lets you discard lands into your yard to cheat it into play early. Diamond is great for that, and if you have Crucible of Worlds, you can play the land out of your graveyard back onto the battlefield. And these artifacts really help you survive cards like Wildfire or Armageddon far better than your opponent, and they make those effects one-sided. Now, Ramunap Excavator is basically another copy of Crucible of Worlds in your deck, which is fantastic because that card is the linchpin for a lot of Lands Matter strategies. Rampaging Ballhaus is a great 6-drop with landfall triggers that makes 4/4 tokens. And if you manage to put this guy down on turn 6 or earlier because you've ramped him out, then you crack a fetch land, you just make 2 tokens immediately, which is nice. And I'm not gonna lie, he's not the best 6-drop in cube, but if you're trying to really support a Lands Matter archetype, this is a great card to include. Chances are Deathrite Shaman's already in your cube. You can use him to exile lands out of your yard to ramp, which is fine early and late, especially if he comes down after Armageddon. So suddenly you've got 2 mana to your opponent's 1, and you can consistently have it for multiple turns because your graveyard is full of lands. Courser of Kruphix and Oracle of Moldiah down there in the bottom middle both help you play lands off the top of your library, which helps you stay ahead of your opponent. Cultivate will help you hit 6 lands faster than your opponent so that you can cast Wildfire while you're at 6 lands and they're at 4, and then they sack 4 lands off and they've got no lands and you've got 2. Yeah, game over, pick up your cards, go home. Nissa Vital Force might be the best Nissa. She's certainly my favorite, turning your lands into creatures and letting you pull permanents out of your graveyard. So if you drop Nissa and then Wrath the board, you can start pulling the lands out of your graveyard and dumping them back into play. Furthermore, there's the very real possibility that you play her 1 turn, plus her 1 turn, and the next turn you ultimate her, and whenever you play a land for the rest of the game, you get to draw a card, which is fantastic. So if your opponent doesn't have an answer to Nissa the moment you play her, then you plus her and you ultimate her. And I know we don't play walkers for their ultimates, but you're going to be able to ult Nissa really fast, and that's something your opponent's got to be aware of. We've already talked about Oracle, so I'm going to skip her. Knight of the Reliquary gets a +1/+1 counter for each card in your graveyard, so if she comes down after a Wildfire or after an Armageddon, she is just a beater. And she also has the ability to feed herself, sacrificing forests or plains and searching up more lands, like Strip Mine, which becomes bananas. Crop Rotation is a way to go find the land you want. Most of the time that's Strip Mine or Wasteland, but there are a lot of other choices because you combine Strip Mine with a card like Ramanap Excavator and your opponent is never going to have more than however many lands they have the turn Strip Mine comes down. So all of these cards are really great Lands Matter support. So how do we win the game if we're playing Lands Matter? Well, let's take a look at that. When you're playing Lands Matter, you're kind of counting on one of 2 things. You're kind of counting on land destruction and making your opponent unable to play Magic, which isn't the most fun, I know, unless you're the one doing it, in which case it's awesome. Or you're counting on landfall triggers to help you win the game. But I do want to point something out about these creatures that I have listed down here, and that is most of them are able to survive Wildfire. If you're going to win through mass land destruction, especially through Wildfire, you need to prioritize creatures with 5 toughness in your draft, because that way they can already be on the board when you cast the Wildfire. And I know Knight of the Reliquary doesn't actually have 4 toughness, but if you've been playing fetch lands or cracking Terramorphic Expanse or shuffling lands into your yard for value, then odds are she's already at 5 toughness anyway. Shoot, she can do it herself, just tapping and sacking a forest to pump herself up over time. So wrathing the board with cards like Wildfire, using Strip Mine to eat your opponent's land away until they don't have any, and then playing a threat is normally good enough to win the game. So how good is Lands Matters in Cube? Well, I'm not going to lie, it's a little lower power than some of the other archetypes, and that's because it takes a little time to get set up. But if you've got the mana rocks, you can actually go off really fast. But other than that, it's going to take a little bit of setup. It's better in a small cube because there isn't quite as much support that's available for other archetypes like aggro or control. This is a really specific archetype, so it's better in a smaller cube. It is a little short of synergistic payoffs, which again is why it's better than in a smaller cube. Avenger of Zendikar is a great 6-drops, as is Balhalf's. But other than that, there aren't a lot of great creature like landfall trigger payoffs. But it is easy to provide support for because chances are you're already running most of the cards in the archetype anyway. And I frequently find that it's neglected in draft, that Crucible of Worlds will wheel around the table a lot of the time, at least in my playgroup. And so as a result, if you want to force the Lands Matter archetype, you don't actually have to try very hard because a lot of the cards will just wheel. Wildfire tends to wheel. Armageddon you need to snatch up pretty quick because the white weenie deck wants it. But cards like Nissa, the green ramp stuff, you prioritize that, and then the payoffs for Lands Matter tend to come around. And I actually encourage you to draft the deck this way. That way, if something happens and the Lands Matter payoffs don't come around, someone else snatches them up, at least you've got the ramp pieces and the mana rock pieces to easily fall into another deck. Whereas if you prioritize Wildfire, Armageddon, Oracle of Moldiah, Crucible of Worlds, and then you realize like, oh my gosh, okay, so none of the ramp stuff is coming to me, how am I going to get ahead on mana? You're kind of already locked into that archetype. So mana stuff first, payoffs and archetype specific stuff later. Let them wheel around the table for you, and that way you still have a lot of options. That's going to do it for today, Cubers. Really appreciate you tuning in. Let us know if there's another archetype you want us to cover in a future video. Check us out on Twitter at cubefortwo. We'll follow back because that's how we do. Or some cool nonsense like the kids are saying nowadays. Anyway, until next time, shuffle up. Keep cubing, my friends.